Hi, welcome to BA Brew. I'm Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Ali.
Hi, I'm Debbie.
Today we're going to talk about systems thinking and how it relates to business analysis. And this is a subject that I was talking about with Ali just a few weeks ago. Ali, to get us started, would it be useful for you to tell us a little bit about your background and why it is that you're interested in, passionate about systems thinking?
Sure. So my background is, like most BAs, probably a bit of a journey, how you ended up being a business analyst. But I was a research scientist for many years. And through that biological thinking, you do have to think about the whole system, not just the individual components of, in my field, drug development. You had to kind of think about the wider system and the impacts of what you were creating and what you were developing. And segueing into becoming a business analyst, I see an organisation very much in the same way as I'd see an organism. It's a system of components that need to work together. If you make an intervention and you change something, that's going to have a ripple effect, positive or negative. So I've brought that thinking, systems biology, into the systems thinking about my BA work. And I work for a charity called Parkinson's UK. There's a lot of change to do, a lot of modernisation of the charity, and we're acutely aware of the unintended consequences of the interventions we're making, whether that's service design or operationally in the background. So it's really important for the work that we do.
Wow. Well, so I'm fascinated about that bit of background, because you were saying that you were looking at the drug intervention. So a drug intervention, I don't know, that to help someone recovering from, I don't know, a problem with their liver might cause an impact on their respiratory system or another element of their body. And I'm thinking about that as an analogy for how does a business system work and operate. I think there's a lot of overlap there. Debbie, do you see I'm presuming you see the correlations between the two?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember when I first encountered systems thinking, which was, gosh, quite a long time ago, and looking at it. And one of the first books that I looked at was Checkland's Soft Systems methodology book, Systems Thinking, Systems Practice, it's called. And interestingly, one of the types of systems he talks about are natural systems, which are, the human body and the systems within the human body. So it completely ties into what Ali's saying. But I just found the whole way of looking at the world through the sort of systems mindset and the systems view absolutely fascinating, because too often you see things, I don't know, announced as legal changes, say, or changes that are going to affect a business, or just things that happen in the environment. And you know that the organizations then have to respond to that in some way. And sometimes these changes can have completely unexpected consequences, and sometimes completely opposite consequences. And one of the ones I often think about is target setting. Where targets are set and then the complete opposite happens, because actually the target itself becomes the focus, and it's almost like the system fights back. Does that make sense, Sally?
I think there's definitely something about the universe, and every action has an equal or opposite reaction. It's energy movement. I'm getting a bit philosophical here, probably. Everything you do has a ripple effect, and you don't know what it's going to be, because our projects, our products, our organizations don't exist in a vacuum. Everything's interconnected. So how on earth can our human brains model that and understand it before we've actually made that intervention? And so that's another analogy with that with science, is you base things on models and they're imperfect by nature. And we do a lot of modelling in business analysis, don't we? We try and represent the organisation so that we can explain what's happening and what might need to change. But those models are imperfect. And so when it comes to implementation of something, that's when you really see how interconnected everything is. And there are examples across any sector all over the world about systems thinking.
So as you were both talking and talking about your backgrounds in systems thinking, when you first came across it, I was trying to think, when did I first come across it? And I think I first came across it when learning about causal loop diagrams, when I was studying business. I was doing an MSc, and I don't think the lecturer mentioned systems thinking, but the causal loop diagrams, he was very, very passionate about them. It was as if they were the only modelling technique that was of any worth for anyone. He was really passionate about them. I remember drawing them and thinking they were interesting. But then systems thinking, I'm not sure. So Debbie, you taught me business analysis essentials, as it would have been, rather than business analysis practice. And you obviously, talked to us as a group about Checkland and Catwoe. But I'm not sure if you would have used the word systems or systemic thinking as you introduced the subject, but it's kind of a soft introduction. But I don't think I'd see those as they were formally when I first learned systems thinking. I think I've come across it because I see systems, and I'll share, for example, going into the healthcare system with a relative, a loved one, and seeing systems where there's a cause and effect, and there seems to be very strange relationships and bits of the system not working, and it's and some working exceptionally well as well. So the positives, and trying to work, well, why is this part of the system functioning really well, and why is this part of the system not working quite so well? And then through study and dialogue, and I've done quite a lot of reading, and I've had Checkland's book out just in the last few weeks, looking at his definitions of systems, and it's quite interesting going back to it as well. But I kind of think that maybe it would be useful for all BAs to have an introduction to systems thinking quite early in their career, to help them build that mindset of thinking about cause and effect and relationships, and looking out for the unintended consequences when changes happen. So which brings me on to mindset. Do you think systems thinking is a mindset? Do you think it can be learned? What's your thoughts? And I'll go to Ali if that's okay.
I'm not sure, actually, if I'm honest, because I think a lot of BA skills are innate for a person, can't necessarily all be taught. They can be trained, but there's some people have a natural aptitude for being able to be in the weeds and the detail and then bring themselves out and see the whole.
Yeah,
and that's really hard to learn. I think in terms of a mindset, what I'm probably looking for is someone who can catastrophize a little, I think is how I'd describe it. Being able to think, this thing we're going to implement here and change here, what is the worst that could happen, and how does it all fit together? Again, I think that's probably a personality trait that a lot of us probably identify with. And I think it's important, not everybody thinks like that, and that's important. It's the same with thinking about reductionist thinking. Being able to focus on something really particular and solve that problem is just as valid as it is to be able to think about the bigger picture, to work together. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think only through experience and practical examples will you be able to see whether you can do it or not. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I'll pass that one over.
Consequence, whether or not that frustrates our colleagues that we work with, because we're thinking ahead and trying to think, well, if X equals Y and it could equal this outcome, that might be really annoying for someone that hasn't got that mindset and thinks that you're being a blocker or doing analysis paralysis, possibly. What do you think, Debbie?
I think it's quite interesting, because I think that this is where systems thinking, to me, when I first encountered it, I thought this is exactly where I think business analysis thinking should go, in terms of having it within our range of abilities and toolkit, if I put it that way. For me, it's quite interesting, because one of the things that was very prevalent back then was what is sometimes called mechanistic or systematic thinking, which is basically, here are the steps, and as long as I follow them, I will end up somewhere successful, which is a way of thinking that I don't really go with very often, because inevitably, if all you're doing is following steps, you are missing the things that are changing around you, which is where I think systems thinking can be so powerful. But I also do agree that in the BA toolkit, I mean, two of my favorite techniques are scenario analysis and impact analysis. And that's not to say you can predict every scenario, and it's not to say you can predict every impact, but at least you're thinking about it. And this is where I think having that ability, that mindset to think about the different factors at play. I mean, you mentioned, Ali, the components that are interacting. To think about those components interacting, to think about it's within an environment that has its own changes going on that are going to impact upon whatever it is you're looking at. I think the ability to think about that and to think through the different possibilities is a real strength for business analysts. So that's why I think having that sort of ability to think systemically gives you something extra as an analyst.
So
Can it be taught? Well, I don't know, Jonathan, actually. I'm like Ali, can it be taught? I think it can be something that people can suddenly have one of those light bulb moments where they see something slightly different. But I do think some people love the comfort blanket of step by step, and therefore it takes them completely out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, you've got to want to be able to think like that, and to be able to think about the whole and the elements that are interacting. What about reductionist thinking then? You might argue that, I suppose, that it's the opposite of systemic thinking. But is there a place for reductionist thinking? Debbie, could you explain to the audience what reductionist thinking is?
It's simply taking something and breaking it into its constituent parts and looking at the parts. And yeah, there's definitely a place for that, because sometimes we do have to look at the parts, but it's then that case of being able to see how it interacts and fits together and look at the whole again. The problem is when people just look at the parts and stop there and think that's going to fix everything, because inevitably it doesn't, because there's always that knock-on impact that you're not thinking about then. But there's definitely a place for it. Yeah, I mean, if you think of medicine, back to some of Ali's comments, there are places for, looking at an individual thing.
I think there's so many examples in healthcare to draw upon. And in service pathways as well, especially Parkinson's UK are very interested in service design and connecting with the NHS and creating referral pathways for people to support them. When you use a reductionist approach, as you said, Debbie, you break it down, and this plays back into our mindset as human beings. We can't digest really complex situations. We have to break it down, and it's part of our method of problem solving. What's that individual problem statement we're going to work on? And then we'll test some solutions against it. And hey, we've got a great solution. Let's release it. And there it is. The problem there is you've removed all of the surrounding environment that it operates in. And then you don't know what's going to happen until it's out there. So there's a really good example with malaria, a specific location where, okay, how are we going to reduce the incidence of malaria in this location? Oh, we're going to give them, stop them getting bitten by giving them mosquito nets. What a great solution. Reality was, when you implement that, the local population, the local context, then used those nets, bed nets, for fishing instead. They didn't use them to protect themselves because they had other needs that weren't considered in context, that wasn't evaluated when you broke that problem down into its smaller parts. So I think it's really important to zoom in and break down problems. But we don't exist in a vacuum. There's so many interactions to think about. So we have to have people who are able to really focus on something. But then business analysts, this is where I think they can excel, is then take everybody back out for a moment and think, well, how is this going to work in the real world?
Yeah. So I wonder, as you're talking there, a brilliant example, Ali, as to whether or not that's where design thinking can come in, to look at the concept, prototype it, test and evaluate it in the real world context, so you can learn from that feedback, those unintended consequences, and that the two together can be, more powerful than one on its own.
I think so. And user-centered design is fundamental to all of the work we do, especially in the charity world. We're here to support people in our communities. There are some elements that, again, we sway into more reductionist thinking, so like personas. we love to categorize things, but that's reductionist.
Mm-hmm.
A person is not that persona. A person is so much more than a data category that we have in our database, and we're complex. So to create a service or a product for someone, for a customer, they're not just one label. They're a whole system of data and interactions in their lives that we need to think about. So I think we need to work closely with user-centered design and be that healthy tension and balance between the two.
Yeah. As you're talking about personas and being a possible, way of thinking in a reductionist way, I'm thinking about user stories and the popularity of them. I'd suggest in recent years they're one of the most widely used requirements techniques. I just think that they maybe offer a little bit of a comfort blanket for some practitioners towards the reductionist, which there is a place for it, but we've got to see the big picture as well. And I think there's other tools, other techniques that can help you see the bigger picture much more than you will ever get from a user story. And it does worry me a little bit, that trend and the prevalence and the popularity of user stories. They're brilliant as a technique on their own, but they don't encourage that bigger picture view in my world, or view anyway. Debbie, any thoughts on that?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think you have to sort of guard against what I call fragmentation. And fragmentation is where you understand a lot of bits, but you don't see them working together. And I do worry that sometimes it is very easy to veer into a fragmented view of anything, and sometimes to make assumptions around a fragmented view as well that aren't tested. And then when it has to work as a whole, it doesn't work because that sort of more systemic, holistic view hasn't been taken. And I think user stories is an example of a technique that used on its own could lead to quite a fragmented view. Whereas if you combine it with other techniques, and if you understand the dangers of fragmenting too far and then not pulling it back together, I think it runs risks. But I think if it's used in context and alongside other techniques, then I think it has a place to actually, play in the analysis work that we do. So everything is in context to me. I mean, everything if I'm asked what, I always think, well, it does depend on the context,
Yes.
I'm a big context person. And personas are interesting as well, you see, as another technique to me, because I really like personas, but I understand them for what they are. And that's the key thing with anything, isn't it? User stories, personas, data models. And it comes right back to what Ali said right at the start, that it's always going to be a bit imperfect. It's a sort of a certain representation, but it's never going to be whole and complete because you can't know everything and there's just too much diversity. That's my take on it.
Wow. I'm thinking there about ego and whether or not, we need to admit to ourselves that we don't have all the answers and that we need to explore and find out and collaborate and test and learn comes in for me. But if you've got a big ego and you think you do know the answers and you do know the precise cause and effects of everything, that could be a real barrier, particularly for if you've got someone that's happy to explore without the ego and they're working with someone who's got a really big ego and does say, well, this is where we're going and this is what we're going to do, and don't worry about the consequences. It could be quite challenging for some BAs out there. Ali, have you come across that at all?
I think we've got a role and a responsibility as a business analyst in an organisation to provide assurance around a project. I don't know anyone else in a project roles who'd be doing that apart from us, in terms of thinking about other projects, other programs that are in flight and building those relationships between them. So yeah, I have seen that, and it you often become the bad person in the room, the naysayer who comes in and says, hang on a second, we need to think about this a bit more detail, or this is a really good idea and if you do this, this will be the impact and consequences down the line. You know, we don't want to create a monster for the organisation. So what's really important to encourage is that safe sandbox experimentation area where you're not impacting anything else, but you can model it and see how it would work. You can test with real users and see when all those requirements and user stories come together, what actually happens, what people actually do with the thing that you've built and spent a lot of money on. So you do have to put the brakes on sometimes, and that doesn't always go down well when, you know, the vision and the timeline's already in someone's mind. But another, apart from assurance, I think it's a BA's integrity to flag and do the right thing, not the easy thing for our work. It's a really principal part of our practice. So have I experienced that? Yes. But I wouldn't be able to sleep very well if I hadn't, you know.
Yeah, you've got the integrity of being a professional. Yeah. Wow. Debbie, what do we need to add to our discussion on systems thinking? What have we missed?
This has been such an interesting conversation for me because it's made my brain zing off in about a million different directions. Every time you or Ali say something, I think, oh, yes, there's that as well, which I guess is the essence of systems thinking, really, isn't it? Because it is the world getting bigger and bigger. But, you know, one of the things that really struck me from what you both just said was I always used to say, I don't believe analysis is a solitary activity. Okay, I believe analysis works so much better when there's a team collaborating or a small group collaborating. And the reason for that is because I don't know everything and you don't know everything, but together we might find most things. And that to me is really what it's about. It's about understanding that there are so many variables. We can't control them all. We can only sort of work with our best toolkit to really try our best. But if we collaborate, I think we can achieve a lot more. And I think systems thinking and that view of the world really helps with that. So that's my sort of final thoughts, I think.
Brilliant. Ali, anything that you want to add as a final thought on systems thinking?
I think I totally agree with all that Debbie said there, and we're not alone in this. And computers may be able to model really complex multivariate data sets all at the same time, but we can't. And so absolutely bringing in everyone's perspectives that we can within the timeframes that we have and the scope that we have to make a best recommendation or decision, and being really honest with our stakeholders that this is all the information we have available and this is the best decision we can make at the time. And then being ready after that to monitor and track any consequences if we do need to make adjustments afterwards. That's all you can do.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what I can add. I just want to mention though, knowledge. We've got to capture, retain, and then be able to retrieve knowledge so that we can learn lessons from other people who've maybe tried something similar in the past and not repeat the same errors maybe as organizations, as change initiative. I do think there's a big place for knowledge and us harnessing the knowledge in us, you know, supporting ourselves and other change professionals in being able to think systemically. But that's my final thought. I just want to say, Ali, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really interesting and having this discussion, this brew with you. And Debbie, thanks for joining us as well. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. If you've got any ideas for future podcasts or would even like to join us, as Ali has today on the podcast itself, please do email us at babrew@AssistKD.com. Thank you.